Hello everyone, Professor Quizlook here. So I wanted to make a video talking about the recent NATO summit which occurred June 24th and the 25th in The Hague, and then tie that with this guns versus butter debate that political scientists and economists write about. So if you've read any news about the NATO summit, it seemed to be pretty successful. There were some concerns going into it that this would be a pretty contentious meeting, that some member states would be fighting with each other, and it seems like everyone, it was pretty successful. And one of the big successes emerging out of the summit is that NATO countries will raise their defense spending to 5% of GDP. That number, that 5% of GDP, was strongly encouraged by U.S. President Donald Trump, who has really for a while now, criticized NATO allies for not contributing enough to the collective defense. President Trump isn't the first U.S. president to criticize NATO members for not spending enough on defense, not spending 2.5% of GDP on defense. But President Trump has been the most outspoken in the public sphere. We saw, and we know from insider accounts that during the Obama administration, during the Biden administration, there were folks trying to get NATO countries to spend more. But Trump's been very outspoken about it, just in the way that Donald Trump interacts with other leaders. So this is seen as a success from the summit, that countries have said that they will get to this 5% of GDP spending on defense. So when we think about why, it's because of threats, concerns about international actors like Russia and China. At this summit in The Hague, Russia was definitely the one talked about the most as being seen as a threat to NATO allies. So this idea that European countries, that NATO countries need to look into the future and see threats down the horizon. And so if they start spending more on defense now, they will be better prepared for those threats down the road. So how do we tie this to the guns versus butter debate? And we'll dig deeper into this in a minute. Is this debate over should states prioritize national security or domestic welfare? The guns versus butter debate is really this trade-off, a choice between the military power, military spending, and public well-being. So at the NATO summit, countries said they will try to, or they will get to this 5% of GDP spending on military. But the reality of that domestically is going to be hard. In democracies, this is going to be hard for leaders to sell to their population that, okay, we want to spend more on defense. So we'll dig deeper into that in a moment. So what happened at the NATO summit? 5% of GDP on defense. This has really been a jump from the long-standing 2% guidelines that NATO countries have tried to hit over the years. Many European countries have struggled to even hit that 2%. Many NATO countries still haven't even reached that 2%. So that 5% of GDP on defense is a leap. But there's a rationale for the increase. So if you listen to national security folks, if you're paying attention to the news, there's a lot of discussion. In the UK, there's a lot of discussion right now. In the US, there's some discussion. Maybe not as front and center as it is in like the UK, in some places in Europe. But this debate that with the ongoing war in Ukraine, there's a fear that Russia's adventurous foreign policy will continue. That Russia in the near future, in the medium range future, will be a threat to European security, and that NATO countries need to prepare for that threat. So although they've struggled to hit 2%, countries are saying that maybe more defense, maybe 5% is where they need to be. There's also this concern about a need for a modernized military infrastructure, more air defenses, new drone technology, and a big investment in cybersecurity, which is all going to take and cost money. So what we're seeing with this war in Ukraine is how war is changing. Drone technology that we didn't have 10 years ago is really altering the battle space. And so there's this idea, NATO saying, okay, we have to spend more money now on this technology. We have to get ahead of defense of drones. We have to better understand how to use drones. And of course, cybersecurity over the past decade has become more and more and more important. So we have seen that NATO countries saying, okay, we have to spend this money. Also discussed at the NATO summit was this greater calls for burden sharing within NATO. So the U.S. has historically shouldered the disproportionate share of spending on NATO. That's why presidents after presidents after presidents have said other European nations need to spend more on defense. Arguing and articulating that the U.S. shouldn't spend so much. So if you listen to Donald Trump, this is something he talks a lot about, that the U.S. is spending too much money. They're carrying too much of the burden. So the idea is that if other countries will spend 5% of their GDP on defense, that'll take some of the pressure away from the U.S. So we see that. The NATO summit, again, if you read about it, it's being perceived as a success. There weren't any major rifts. There were some concerns going into it that Trump might go and criticize and just not create a hostile environment, but antagonize other NATO countries. And that didn't really happen. It seemed to be pretty productive. Trump's speeches and reports coming out of the administration are pretty positive, honestly, about NATO. So let's think for a minute a little deeper about the guns versus butter debate and put this in context. So this guns versus butter model, which political scientists use, economists use, really is a metaphor for the fundamental trade-off in public budgeting. So when we think about guns, spending on the military, national security, and defense. At the NATO conference, at the NATO summit, this is what they're focusing on. This idea of guns. We need to spend more money for national security. We live in an increasingly hostile environment, so we have to spend more. But then when we think about the butter side of it, spending on consumer goods, social programs like healthcare, education, pension plans for workers, safety nets for society, infrastructure within the country, and public housing. Something that we probably hear a little bit more about in the US right now from many elected officials. So you'll hear elected officials talk about, okay, we need to spend more money here at home. We'll hear about people living on the streets. We hear about falling apart infrastructure. So this we hear a lot about in the U.S. Elected officials wanting to be elected officials are talking about this side of the debate. So we know that within a society there are finite resources. So because governments have finite resources, increasing one typically requires reducing another. Unless, of course, taxes are raised, which isn't popular in a democracy, or debt is increased, which right now we live in a time of increasing debt and concern about increasing debt. In American politics and European politics, there's a lot of discussion about this increasing of debt. And again, people don't want to see taxes increased. So it's this trade-off when you have a finite resource. So this model, the guns versus butter debate, helps explains domestic pressure governments face when responding to global security threats. So in Europe, again, remember, many NATO countries have struggled to hit that 10% mark. In Europe, many countries have traditionally favored butter over guns, especially since the Second World War. Many have built pretty robust welfare states, universal healthcare systems, more of a social safety net, and have spent, again, much to the chagrin and frustration of administrations, have spent less on military spending, less on that gun side of the debate. So the reality is that increasing defense spending to 5% of GDP would require pretty deep structural changes in national budgets across Europe, potentially diverting funds from programs that are popular amongst the voting population. So here we see that this will require and this will force pretty tough political choices, especially with aging populations, with post-COVID fiscal stresses in Europe, an economy that's not growing as fast as the US. So why does this matter? If we're talking about this guns versus butter debate, there might be public backlash against cuts to social services. Political instability could emerge if austerity measures are introduced because money needs shifted from butter to guns. We might see that this will, elected officials might face a lot of pushback from the constituency. So then why does that matter? So if we think of a success of the NATO summit is that countries have agreed to move from 2% of GDP to 5% of the GDP to spend on military expenditures. It raises the question of, is this possible? We know and we think that, okay, we come together at a summit, we make an agreement, and countries will get it done. But in a democracy, if you have a large group of citizens who maybe don't feel that Russia is a threat, or don't see Russia as a threat, or don't see China as a threat, or don't view these other countries as a threat, they might be, and history has shown us, and the empirical evidence has shown us, that they might really push back against increases in spending on defense. So then that puts elected officials in a difficult position. If they increase that defense spending, well, they might get voted out of office. Their party might lose that next election. So this is a great example of how domestic politics plays a role in international relations. Scholars, academics, policymakers see these threats, see threats from Russia, see threats from non-state actors around the world. But in democracies, people have a voice. They can say, no, we don't want to spend this money. And if you spend this money, we will vote you out. And so over the next months and years, this is going to be the reality that European countries face if they want to increase spending on the military, if they want to hit that 5% target. Will there be domestic political blowback? And then what will that mean domestically? Will it create some instability? And then what does that mean if they don't spend more money on defense? Does that open a situation where there are hostile actors in the world? So I just wanted to kind of make a video quickly talking about what happened at the NATO summit, and then just talk about how what we perceive as a success has some real world political, economic implications. So, if you made it to the end, I thank you. Hopefully leave a comment and tell me what you want to talk about next. Thank you.